This game is the evergreen game played in 1852 between Adolf Anderssen and Jean Dufresne. It's known as the evergreen game because its contemporaries said that as long as chess was played, this spectacular game would be appreciated. So far, they've been absolutely right. This is one of two very famous games won by Adolf Anderssen in the time. The other one was won a year earlier in 1851 against Lionel Kaiseritsky. That's the Immortal game, and we'll look at that in a separate video. Now, this game is a little bit less famous than the Immortal game, but I think it's even better for teaching some great concepts like the value of development, central control, the value of material in the opening, and also how to attack an uncastled king. So, without further ado, let's get right to the game. E4 begins the game. Of course, this is the most popular first move. As Bobby Fischer said, it's best by test. It lets out the bishop and the queen and aims for rapid development of the kingside and castling. E5, of course, good for the same reasons. Knight F3, developing and attacking this E5 pawn. Knight C6, developing and defending the pawn. Bishop C4, the Italian game. The bishop is placed on an excellent central diagonal where it attacks the soft F7 pawn. I've always been partial to this move by myself, although Bishop B5 is actually a little bit more popular. Bishop C5. This, of course, is good for the same reasons. We're developing and also putting our bishop on a good diagonal. B4. Now, this is something worth talking about. B4 introduces the Evans Gambit. Many of you might not be familiar with gambits. Basically, they're simply moves in the opening that give up a pawn or even more, sometimes a piece, in return for some intangibles. We think of the pawn as being a tangible material thing, and then development, tempo, castling, king safety. These kinds of things are intangibles that you're hoping to get back for your gambited pawn. So the Evans Gambit intends, after bishop takes B4, which black does play, to expand in the center and to gain activity for the pieces. Pawn C3 is ready to support D4, which is going to come in a moment. Bishop A5 retreats the bishop and keeps the bishop in line with the white king, hoping to exert some pressure. Pawn D4, this expands in the middle of the board. Of course, white temporarily at least has a perfect pawn center. Perfect pawn center is pawns on D4 and E4. The two pawns are great. They're typically flexible and they support each other, and you can advance either one of them effectively in many cases. Now, at this point, I do like the move pawn D6. This has become popular recently. Keeping a firm point on E5 tends to work out well for black, and in modern play, black has actually done so well, I think, with D6 that top-level grandmasters have been avoiding this line. So, in the game, we get a different move. We get pawn takes D4. Pawn takes D4 is, of course, sensible because you're eliminating an important central pawn for white, but you're also spending time capturing stuff. Typically, that's considered quite greedy, and you can be punished if you focus on winning a bunch of pawns in the opening and you don't develop your pieces. Castles. Of course, we love castling because it makes our king safe and it gets our rook out of the corner of the board. In this case, it has another threat as well. There's a threat simply to capture the pawn on D4 because there's no longer a pin that we had a moment ago with the bishop to our king, so the C3 pawn is now free to move and capture. I want to mention that if black captures here on C3, white can play queen B3 in response. This has worked out very, very well for white. There is a famous game between Bobby Fischer and Reuben Fine that went queen E7, knight takes C3, knight F6, and knight D5. And after an exchange, we've got another threat here to capture this knight, and we've also opened the E file, and black's queen and king are on that file. I have actually had this happen in my own play, and like Bobby Fischer, I found the attack absolutely overwhelming, so maybe if you're lucky, you'll get to do this in one of your games as well. In the game, black is not greedy and doesn't capture on C3. D3. I'm not crazy about this move. The idea is simply to give back the pawn without allowing white to build the perfect pawn center, but white doesn't need to recapture this pawn right away because it can be easily picked up later, and also you've spent a tempo on this move. You could have been developing a knight and castling. Queen B3 attacking this pawn right here on F7, Queen F6 developing and defending, E5 expanding in the middle and harassing the queen. Now, you cannot capture this pawn because after knight takes E5, very, very greedy, Rook E1 threatens this knight, and the knight can't move because it's pinned to the king right here. The only way to support the knight is pawn D6, but Queen B5 check is then a fork that hits the king and the bishop. Sometimes you can save the bishop on A5 here with knight C6, but in this case, that can't be played because there's a pin on the knight, so we just win the bishop on E5 on the next move. Go us. So after E5, since black can't take the pawn on E5, Queen G6 is played, moving the queen and also defending this pawn and still hoping to make white spend some time winning this pawn back. Rook E1 developing and putting the rook on the same line as the black king, although with the E5 pawn in the way, the rook might not be doing that much here and there could be other better moves. Check the notes. Knight E7 developing the knight and getting ready to castle. Love that. Bishop A3 developing the bishop and putting some pressure on this knight, which makes a lot of sense. But this now was the perfect time to castle. Black didn't do this, but if black had done this, white could later win this pawn back pretty easily, but white would still be down a pawn. White absolutely has compensation for the pawn, but it's not as though we can say that white is winning or anything like that. There's a lot of game left to be played. Castle. It's going to benefit your game so much. Instead, after bishop A3, we get B5. Now, B5 is a bad move, but I like the spirit of it. The idea is simply to give up a pawn for a little bit of activity. It's the same idea that white had with B4. The problem is we don't get nearly enough activity. The queen captures the pawn, the rook comes to B8, which is kind of the point. This is the activity that black was hoping for, but now the queen comes back to A4. And how active is this rook? Is it really targeting anything really valuable? Is it coordinating with black's other pieces? This is not enough for a pawn here. I would not have given the pawn with B5. In any case, now black plays bishop b6. The reason for bishop b6 is that we can't castle right here. If we castle, these two pieces are defended by the one knight on c6. When that happens, a lot of times you can just capture one of the pieces and then just win the other piece right here. So because of that problem, the bishop retreats back to b6. Another loss of time and we're not getting castled. At this point, probably good was queen d1 going after the d3 pawn, and white still has a lot of compensation here and an extra b5 pawn that white did not need to have. However, knight bd2 is played. Makes sense here. Again, it is time for black to castle, but bishop b7, a developing move that is eyeing g2. The queen and bishop are all pointing at this line, but there are two knights in the way, so it's hard to believe there could be too much counterplay on g2. And again, black needs to castle. So after bishop b7, knight e4, putting another piece on this diagonal, but also interrupting the queen's defense of the d3 pawn so the bishop can capture it. And when the bishop captures, the black queen is not going to feel safe. At this point, I think black goes a little crazy. You had to castle. Now, after bishop takes d3, the queen is in trouble. White is already threatening to move this knight into f6 check and win the black queen. I love white's position at this point, but at least black is castled and you can try to fight. However, after knight e4, black plays queen f5. I don't have enough question marks to give this move. I really don't understand in this critical moment, spinning a move to slide the queen from g6 to f5. It is no better on f5, and the loss of tempo is just criminal. So after queen f5, bishop takes d3. The bishop is great here, and of course, it's lined up with the black queen. Now you definitely can't castle because of knight f6 check, a discovery after the knight is captured. The queen simply falls over here on f5. So after bishop takes d3, queen h5. The queen had to move. Again, I just think that this is criminal. The dance here in a position where black is needing to castle so desperately, moving the queen to f5 and then to h5 is just such a costly, completely pointless loss of time. But in any case, queen h5 does happen. Now, at this point, white plays one of the moves that makes this game so famous. It's probably not the best move though. Knight g3 was really good here. The queen is in a lot of trouble. After she pulls back, you can just develop the rook and then pull back the queen right here. The queen is, pull back the bishop and attack the queen. The queen is in so much trouble here that she only has this square, and then white can sacrifice here because if the king captures, the knight creates a royal fork. This is just absolutely overwhelming. However, this is really computer-esque play, and I don't want to criticize white for missing this. Instead, white plays knight f6 check. This makes so much sense. It's not the best move, and black actually has decent counterplay after this, but I really do like the principles at play here. Knight f6 check is trying to sacrifice the knight to open the e-file and get at the black king that has been neglecting castling for so long. The black king is going to suffer for neglecting castling, but with better play, black could have shown that this was not the correct way to punish it. Of course, the knight must be captured because there's a royal fork. The queen is hit, so if you move the king, then we'll just capture the queen. G takes f6, and E takes f6, recapturing and opening up the e-file. The problem is that even though white is winning back his piece, if he wins the knight on e7 with the pawn, then he's actually not going to be able to get to the king on e8 that's hiding behind his white pawn. So black has time for rook g8, placing the rook on the newly opened g-file and immediately creating big threats like queen takes knight because there's a pin on the g2 pawn. At this point, I want to mention that if white had captured with f takes e7, getting the piece back right away, the black king is totally safe here on e8. The rook is just staring at its own pawn going, get out of my way, and the pawn cannot get out of the way. It would like to so much, but it's what is known as an umbrella pawn, and it just keeps the black king safe. Black is winning here with simply queen takes f3, going after g2, and after g3, this bishop is still over here, so black can capture here. And after queen takes right here, you can't capture the queen because you're pinned. Black has a winning attack here. Fantastic stuff. So, after rook g8, white plays what I think is one of the great moves in the game. White has all of his pieces over here participating in an excellent attack against the black king right here on e8. However, there is one piece, the rook on a1, that is not participating. So, rook a d1 includes that final piece in the attack. We're going to see that this move introduces some very specific ideas, although they're easy to miss, and black did miss them in the game. There is a way out for black, though, but black has to be so precise to find it. The way out was queen h3, threatening mate here on g2. The point is that the queen is defending the d7 pawn. As we'll see in the game, the d7 square is absolutely critical, which is why this move is better than taking the knight that we'll see in the game. So after queen h3, bishop f1 is needed to defend mate right here. Black still needs to keep d7 defended, but the key move is queen f5 in this position. This is very, very hard to see. I would be stunned if even one of the top grandmasters today found queen h3 and then queen f5. The point is to eliminate the pawn on f6. So this all actually works out for black, and black holds the balance with this very fancy maneuver that keeps d7 defended and creates threats and goes after the f6 pawn. However, in the game, black plays queen takes f3, which makes so much sense. Of course, we're picking up a knight and we're threatening mate down here on g2. But now it is white's turn, and white has 2 rooks, 2 bishops, and 2 queens pointing at a king on e8. To put it mildly, that is very, very risky. So I want you to pause your video and try to figure out how you can use all of these pieces to get to the king on e8. The key here is rook takes e7, not pawn takes when again the pawn gets in our way. Instead, we take with the rook, which opens critical lines of attack. Now, the knight captures here on e7, and we need an even more spectacular move in this position. Again, there is mate threatened here on g2, so if you waste a tempo, it's you that gets checkmated. Queen takes d7. Boom. Drop the mic. This is a fantastic move that makes the game famous, although there's much to appreciate in the game besides just this move. Black is, of course, forced to capture because moving the king just gets mated by bishop takes e7. So the black king does capture here on d7, and now we get bishop to f5. This is double check. Both the bishop and the rook give check. We already saw this in the famous game Lasker versus Thomas. When you're in double check, the only way to get out of it is to move the king. That's really important because black is actually threatening 2 separate checkmates if only there was a moment for black to move. So I do want to mention that bishop b5, the other double check, doesn't work because this allows the king to run up the board, and after bishop check here, the king can take the pawn and get away. After bishop f5 check, this isn't possible because if the king tries to run up to c6, the sister square of e6, we actually have an amazing checkmate. Actually, one of my favorite mates in the game with bishop d7, where the rook defends the bishop and the other bishop covers the dark squares. Fantastic checkmate. So, after bishop f5 check, the king is pushed back, it goes to e8, now bishop d7 check, and whichever direction the king moves in, we simply have mate by capturing on e7 right here. A fantastic finish to a fantastic game. I hope that you've enjoyed this game as much as I've enjoyed showing it. If you like the game and the video, please do like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos.